I was working on a deal recently that almost crashed and burned after the LOI was signed, but before the PSA was even signed. Something happened that neither I, the buyer, or the seller really anticipated. So I want you as the investor to add this to your checklist when you're buying your next deal. Let's go! So I was involved in this deal recently where the seller was open to receiving offers, but didn't want to do a full-on marketing program and didn't want to list the asset with a broker. They were content on just keeping the property and improving it well into the future. Now, as a result, they did not want to rock the boat with their staff or any tenants until they knew they had a committed buyer, meaning a signed PSA and deposits in the bank. So I found a very good buyer and we negotiated and signed a full letter of intent. During the time that the seller was putting together the PSA for the buyer to review, the buyer went ahead and started calling vendors to set up for their inspections once the PSA was signed. Now, as a side note, this letter of intent did have a pretty short due diligence period, so the buyer, especially in this market when everyone's so busy, wanted to begin lining up electricians and roofers and pool guys and plumbers. Well, if you've watched some of my other videos on this channel, you know how small of a world the multifamily investment world is. There's only 996 investors that own every single asset over 10 units in the northern half of Florida, and there's only 403 investors that own all the ones over 100 units. Well, the vendor market world in each prospective market is no different. Shortly after the buyer began making phone calls to vendors, the vendors then began calling the leasing agents, the on-site property managers, the maintenance personnel to ask why they're selling the asset and will they be able to continue servicing the property with the new buyer and when is the closing. Then, of course, the on-site staff calls the asset manager at corporate and the corporate has to either confess or come up with the reason why this is happening. Then the asset manager calls me to call the buyer to call off the dogs. It went from 0 to 100 miles an hour bad real quick. Now, luckily we were able to save it and continue down the path, but you can see how that would be pretty upsetting to the seller. Okay, so lesson number one, I do think it is appropriate and important for buyers to begin thinking of the vendors they're going to use during inspections so that you can move quickly, particularly in small due diligence periods, and preferably lining them up so that they can be done in 1 to 2 days with all the inspections. Researching who you think those vendors may be is a good thing in advance. That way you're not spending the first week of your short due diligence period trying to figure out who the heck you're even going to call. However, particularly in secondary or tertiary markets, a lot of these vendors who are good are used by the same owners of assets in the same market. Lord knows when you find good vendors that do good work and show up on time and do it at the right price, they're going to be popular. Lesson number 2, refrain from calling any vendors until the PSA is signed, your deposits are in, and you've gotten the green light from the seller that they've talked to their staff and everything's good to go. And lesson number 3, it may actually be a good idea to run any vendor you intend to call by the seller because they may have a history or reasons as to why you should or shouldn't call on that vendor. There may be a history with that vendor of abrasive behavior with tenants and staff. Maybe they were incompetent. They didn't show up on time consistently, or they didn't complete the work, or some vendors may have been banned from the property altogether by the seller. I'm not saying the seller gets to dictate how you run your due diligence process. I'm just saying that the seller and the on-site staff had a lot of history in that market and on their property with lots of different vendors and can offer you valuable input on who you may or may not want to use. Buyers, the more you can keep the seller's interest in mind, the more that seller and that listing broker are going to want to bring you more deals. I hope this video brought you a lot of value, and if it did, give me a like and a subscribe down below, and I'll see you guys on the next one.